He thought it was just a meal, until a piece of metal stopped his world cold. The fork never reached Ethan Calloway's mouth, hanging there in the still air as sunlight slipped through the cracked wooden shutters and landed on something beneath his plate. Something that did not belong in a quiet roadside diner, where the coffee smelled burnt and the dust never settled. And for a long second no one noticed the shift except the woman standing across from him, Clara Whitfield, her hands folded at her waist, her posture straight but tired, the kind of tired that came from years, not days. And she said nothing, because she never did, not to men like him, not to men who walked in wearing polished boots and the kind of confidence that made other people step aside without thinking. And Ethan had walked in like that just minutes ago, brushing past the door with a hand that owned too many things to care about one more, taking a seat without asking, tapping once on the table instead of speaking. Because in this town people understood that sound meant service, meant hurry, meant don't waste his time. And Clara had come forward quietly, her steps soft against the warped floorboards, placing down a plate of steak and beans cooked just right. The kind of meal that didn't look like much, but carried the weight of someone who still believed in doing things properly even when no one thanked her for it. And Ethan hadn't looked at her, not once, not when she set the napkin, not when she poured the coffee, not when her fingers lingered a second longer than necessary, near the edge of the plate, as if placing something more than just food, something intentional, something chosen. And now here he was, frozen, because the knife had scraped against metal that wasn't supposed to be there, a dull sound that cut through the quiet like a whisper no one else could hear. And when he lifted the plate just slightly, just enough for the light to slip under, he saw it, a small badge, old, scorched along one edge, the engraving barely visible, but not lost, never lost. Because a man doesn't forget something like that, not when it carries a memory he buried 10 years deep and never dared to dig up again. And across from him Clara finally raised her eyes, not angry, not pleading, just steady, just certain, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, not for him to speak, but for him to remember. And in that silence, heavier than anything said aloud, Ethan Calloway realized this wasn't just a meal, and it never had been. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, like dust catching a different kind of light. And Ethan Calloway slowly lowered the fork back to the plate without making a sound, his eyes fixed on the scorched badge as if it might disappear if he blinked too quickly. But it did not. It stayed there, heavy, real, and closer than it had any right to be. And the faint outline of the name began to surface in his mind before he even dared to read it. Whitfield, the letters worn but not erased. The same name spoken once on a dry evening years ago when the sky had turned the color of ash and a man had stood with quiet dignity at the edge of something Ethan chose not to understand. And now that name sat beneath his meal like a truth he could no longer step around. And still Clara Whitfield did not speak. She did not move closer, did not explain, because she did not need to. Her silence carried more weight than any accusation, and Ethan felt it pressing against his chest in a way no threat ever had, because this was not fear, not danger. It was recognition, the kind that strips a man of the stories he tells himself. And he finally lifted his gaze to meet hers fully, not as a customer, not as a man used to being served, but as someone searching for something he had lost the moment he decided to look away all those years ago. And her eyes did not soften, did not harden either. They simply held steady, as if they had learned long ago that waiting could be stronger than speaking. And around them the diner carried on in quiet rhythm. A chair creaked, a cup touched wood, someone coughed near the back, unaware that a life had just bent in a direction no one else could see. And Ethan swallowed slowly, though he had taken no bite, his throat dry in away coffee. Could not fix, and his hand hovered near the badge before pulling back, not out of fear, but out of something closer to understanding, because touching it would mean admitting it was real. Admitting that the past did not stay buried just because a man rode far enough away. And for the first time since he walked into that room, Ethan Calloway did not know what to do next, and Clara Whitfield, who had been invisible to everyone for years, stood there in the quiet, holding the one thing he could not outrun. The badge stayed where it was, catching the light in a way that refused to be ignored, and Ethan Calloway finally let his fingers move, slow, careful, like a man approaching something that might break if handled wrong. Though he knew this would not break, this would hold, because it had already survived more than he ever wanted to remember. And when he lifted it from beneath the plate, the weight surprised him, heavier than it looked, heavier than memory should feel, and the edge was rough wear. The metal had once been exposed to heat, a scar that did not fade with time, and he turned it just enough to read the name fully. Whitfield, clear now, undeniable, and something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with truth arriving without asking permission. And across from him, Clara Whitfield remained still, but there was a shift, not in her stance, but in the space between them, because now he held the proof in his own hand, not a story, not a rumor, but something that had belonged to a man he remembered choosing not to help when it would have mattered. And the memory did not come all at once. It came in fragments, a fence line, a quiet voice, a look that asked for nothing but still carried expectation, and Ethan had turned away from it, telling himself it was not his concern, that a man had to look after his own interests first, that there would always be someone else to step in, but no one had, and now the silence in the diner felt like an echo of that moment, stretched across years and placed back in front of him without warning. And he set the badge down gently on the table, not under the plate this time, but out in the open where it could not be hidden again, and his eyes lifted slowly to Clara, searching for something, perhaps anger, perhaps accusation, but finding neither, only a steady patience that felt far more difficult to face, because it did not push, it did not demand, it simply waited, and that waiting forced him to see himself without the comfort of excuses, and he cleared his throat, though no words came, because what could be said that would change what had already been decided years ago? And the sounds of the diner continued around them, distant now, like a world that had stepped back to give this moment space. And Ethan realized that the woman in front of him had not brought the badge to shame him, not to threaten him, but to place a choice back in his hands, the kind of choice he had once ignored. And for the first time in a long while, he understood that what he did next would not be measured by money or power, but by whether he could stand still long enough to face what he had avoided. And Clara Whitfield, who had said nothing since he walked in, had already said more than anyone else ever had. The badge lay between them now, no longer hidden, no longer softened by distance or time. And Ethan Calloway kept his eyes on it for a moment longer before finally speaking, his voice low, unfamiliar even to himself, as if it had not been used for anything honest in years. He said the name once under his breath, Whitfield, and the sound seemed to settle into the wood of the table, into the quiet of the room, into something that had been waiting to be acknowledged. And Clara Whitfield did not react, not outwardly, but there was a shift in the stillness she carried, a slight easing in her shoulders, not relief, not forgiveness, just the recognition that he had seen what she had placed in front of him and had chosen not to look away this time. And that alone changed something, even if it did not fix anything. And Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight, his hand resting near the badge but not touching it again, because once had been enough. And he glanced around the diner for the first time since he sat down, really looked this time, at the worn counter, the chipped mugs, the window that let in more dust than light, and he realized how easily he had dismissed places like this, how quickly he had reduced them to background, to something beneath notice, just like the people inside them. And his gaze returned to Clara, standing in the same spot, patient, unyielding in a quiet way that did not demand anything, but did not retreat either. And he drew in a slow breath, steadying himself not against danger, but against the weight of a moment that asked for something he had spent years avoiding. And when he spoke again, it was not loud, not commanding, but measured, careful, as if each word had to earn its place. He asked how she came to have it. But even as the question left his mouth, he understood that the answer mattered less than the fact that it had been kept, protected, carried all this way without losing its meaning. And Clara's eyes held his for a second longer before she finally moved, just one small step closer to the table, close enough that the light caught the faint lines on her hands, the kind that come from work done without pause, without praise. And she placed her fingertips lightly on the edge of the table, not reaching for the badge, not taking it back, just grounding herself in the space between them. And in that moment, Ethan understood that this was not about the past alone. It was about what remained after it, what a person chose to carry forward and what they chose to leave behind. and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with everything unsaid, everything understood, and for the first time since he walked into that diner, Ethan Calloway did not feel like the man who owned half the town. He felt like a man being seen clearly, without distance, without illusion, and there was nowhere left to step aside to. Clara Whitfield did not answer his question, not with words, and that absence carried more truth than anything she could have said, because the story of how she came to hold that badge was written in the way she stood there, steady and unshaken, in the way her eyes did not leave his. And Ethan Calloway understood that whatever path had brought it back to him had not been easy, had not been quick, and had not been forgotten for even a single day. And he exhaled slowly, a breath that seemed to leave behind more than just air, as if something inside him had finally given way, and his gaze dropped once more to the badge before lifting again. But this time there was no searching in his eyes, no confusion, only a quiet acceptance that the past had found him not by chance, but because it had never truly let go. And he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, not in command, not in ownership, but in something closer to humility, a posture that did not come naturally to him. And the room seemed to notice, though no one turned, no one spoke. It was just there, a subtle shift like the air before a storm that never comes. And Ethan's voice came again, softer now, stripped of the certainty it once carried. And he said he remembered. Not everything, not every detail, but enough to know that he had walked away when staying might have changed something. Enough to understand that silence in that moment had not been neutral, it had been a choice. And Clara listened, not nodding, not interrupting, just letting the words exist between them without reaching out to shape them. Because this was not about hearing an explanation. It was about watching whether he could stand in the truth without turning away again. And for a moment, Ethan thought about offering more, about filling the silence with reasons, with circumstances, with the kind of justifications that had carried him this far. But something in Clara's stillness stopped him, something that made it clear that this space did not need excuses, it needed honesty. And so he let the words fall away, leaving only what remained when everything else was stripped back. And his hand moved once more, not to take the badge, not to hide it, but to turn it gently so that the name faced her again, as if returning it in some small, incomplete way. And he asked one more question, not how she got it, not why she kept it, but what she wanted now. And that question hung there, simple on the surface, but carrying the weight of everything beneath it. Because for the first time since he walked into that diner, Ethan Calloway was not assuming the answer, he was asking for it. And Clara Whitfield, who had waited through years of silence to reach this moment, finally moved her hand from the edge of the table and rested it lightly beside the badge, not claiming it, not pushing it away, just placing herself beside it. And in that quiet gesture, she showed him that what came next would not be decided by what he had been, but by what he chose to be now. Clara Whitfield did not rush to answer, and that pause stretched just long enough to make Ethan Calloway understand that whatever she would say next had been carried for years, shaped by time, not by impulse. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, low, steady, not fragile, not sharp, just certain. And she said she did not come for his money, and the words landed differently than anything he had expected, because money had always been the answer to most things in his world, a way to settle, to smooth, to close doors without stepping through them. But here it meant nothing, and he felt that truth settle in his chest as clearly as the badge had in his hand. And Clara continued, not raising her voice, not stepping closer, just letting each word stand on its own. She said the land behind this town, the small stretch near the creek, the one everyone ignored because it never turned a profit, it had once belonged to her husband. And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly as recognition followed, not of the place itself, but of the decision he had made years ago to take it, to fold it into something larger, something more efficient, something that made sense on paper but had erased more than it accounted for. And Clara did not accuse him. She did not need to. The facts sat plainly between them, and she said that land was not valuable to men like him, but it was everything to the man whose name sat on that badge. And for a moment Ethan looked away, not out of avoidance, but because the image of that quiet piece of land, dry in summer, soft in spring, came back to him in a way it never had before, not as property, but but as something someone had once stood on with pride. And when he looked back at her, she had not moved. But there was something else now, not expectation, not demand, but a simple line drawn in the sand of this moment. And she said she wanted it back, not for wealth, not for power, but because some things were not meant to be absorbed into someone else's story. And the diner seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. And Ethan felt the weight of that request settle in a place deeper than any deal he had ever made. Because this was not negotiation, this was restoration, and there was no contract he could hide behind, no number he could offer to reshape it into something easier. And his hand moved slightly on the table, not reaching for the badge, not pulling away from it, just resting there as he considered something he had not considered in a long time. The idea that giving something back could cost more than taking it ever did. And Clara Whitfield, who had stood silent through his arrival, through his arrogance, through his past choices catching up to him, now stood with her truth laid bare, not asking for pity, not asking for favor, but asking for something that belonged to her long before he ever decided it was his. And Ethan Calloway realized that this moment, quiet as it was, would define him far more than anything he had built before. The request settled into the space between them with a weight that no coin or contract could match. And Ethan Calloway did not answer right away, because this was not the kind of question a man like him was used to facing. Not in this way. Not without leverage. Not without distance. And he leaned back slowly, the chair creaking again beneath him as his gaze drifted past Clara Whitfield toward the window, where sunlight stretched thin across the dusty street outside. And for a moment he saw it differently. Not as territory, not as something measured in acres and profit, but as pieces of lives stitched together by choices, by moments that could not be undone once they were made. And he thought about the land she had named, that narrow stretch by the creek, the one he had once dismissed as useless. And he remembered signing papers without hesitation, folding it into something larger, something cleaner, something that erased its past without asking who it belonged to before. And now that past stood in front of him in the form of a woman who had not raised her voice, had not demanded, had simply waited until he could no longer ignore what he had taken. And his hand moved slowly across the table, not toward the badge this time, but toward the edge where his hat rested, his fingers brushing the brim as if grounding himself in something familiar. And he realized how many times he had walked into rooms like this believing he understood everything that mattered, believing that ownership meant certainty, that control meant clarity, but none of that held here. Not now. Not with Clara standing across from him with nothing but truth and patience. And he exhaled again, slower this time. And when he spoke, his voice carried something different. Not hesitation, not resistance, but the weight of a decision forming without the usual defenses. And he said the land had been part of a larger deal, that it had been signed over, processed, recorded, and for a brief second it sounded like the beginning of an excuse, like the language he had always used to shield himself from what lay beneath. But then he stopped, the words falling away before they could build into something false, and he shook his head slightly, more to himself than to her, as if rejecting that old instinct in real time. And he leaned forward again, resting his hands flat on the table now, open, visible, with nothing hidden, and he said it could be undone, not easily, not cleanly, but it could be done. And the simplicity of that statement carried more meaning than any long explanation ever could. And Clara did not react immediately, but there was a shift in her eyes, not relief, not gratitude, something steadier, something that recognized a man stepping into a different version of himself, even if it was only for this one moment. And Ethan nodded once, not as a gesture to her, but as a commitment to the choice he had just made. And outside the wind moved across the empty road, lifting dust into the air, before letting it fall again, quiet, unnoticed, the way change often begins, without spectacle, without noise, just a man deciding not to turn away this time. The decision hung in the air, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment neither of them moved, as if both understood that once this moment passed, nothing would return to what it had been before. And Ethan Calloway reached for his coat slowly, not with urgency, not with the impatience that had once defined him, but with a measured calm that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done. And he pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges from being carried more out of habit than necessity, and placed it on the table beside the badge. The ink still clear, the signature still bold, the proof of ownership that had once meant control and now felt more like a question waiting to be answered. And he slid it slightly toward Clara Whitfield, not as a display, not as a show of power, but as something he was ready to release, and his fingers lingered on it for a second before lifting away, as if marking the point where possession ended and responsibility began, and Clara's eyes dropped to the paper, not rushing, not reaching, just observing it the same way she had watched everything else, with patience that did not bend under pressure, and the diner around them continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that a line was being redrawn in a place no one else could see. And Ethan spoke again, his voice steady, not asking, not explaining, just stating that the land would be returned, that the papers would be changed, that whatever process stood in the way would be handled, not because it was easy, but because it was right. And the words did not sound like a promise meant to impress. They sounded like something heavier, something rooted in a decision already made. And Clara lifted her gaze back to him. And for the first time there was a change, small, almost invisible, but real, a softening not of forgiveness, but of recognition, as if she had been waiting not for the outcome, but for the truth behind it. And Ethan nodded once, not expecting gratitude, not seeking approval, just acknowledging that this moment had reached its turning point. And he reached into his pocket again, pulling out a small stack of bills and placing them beside the plate. More than enough for the meal, more than enough for anything the diner could offer, but this time the money looked different, smaller somehow, like it belonged to another world that did not quite touch this one. And he stood up slowly, the chair scraping softly against the floor, and for a second he hesitated, his eyes returning to the badge still resting between them, and instead of taking it, he left it there, where it belonged, where it had always belonged. And as he turned toward the door, the light outside spilling across the floorboards, he paused just long enough to understand that this was not an ending, not a resolution, but the beginning of something he would have to carry forward beyond this room, beyond this moment. And Clara Whitfield remained where she stood, her hand resting near the badge, her presence steady, unchanged, because she had not come to watch him leave. She had come to make sure he finally stayed long enough to choose differently. And now that he had, the silence between them no longer felt heavy, it felt complete. The door opened with a soft creak, and Ethan Calloway stepped out into the dry afternoon light, the kind that settled over the town without warmth, just presence. And for a moment he did not move, standing there with his hat in hand, as if the weight of it had changed, as if something as simple as stepping forward now carried more consequence than it had before. And behind him the diner returned to its quiet rhythm, cups set down, chairs shifting, voices low and distant, but inside that small space something had already been altered in a way no one else could name. And Ethan finally placed the hat back on his head, not with his usual ease, but with a slower motion, like a man aware of himself in a way he had not been before. And he stepped down from the wooden porch, boots meeting the dust of the street that he had walked 100 times without ever really seeing. And now every detail felt sharper, the lines of the buildings, the worn tracks in the ground, the stillness between movements. And he turned his gaze toward the far edge of town, toward the direction where the creek lay beyond the open land, a place he had once measured only in terms of use, of expansion, of numbers that fit neatly into ledgers and plans. But now it stood in his mind as something else entirely, something tied to a name, to a life, to a choice he had made without understanding what it would cost someone else. And he began to walk, not quickly, not with purpose that demanded attention, but with a steady pace that came from knowing there was no longer a reason to delay. And as he moved past the storefronts and the few people who glanced his way, something in their eyes lingered a second longer than usual, not because they knew what had happened, but because they sensed the difference in the way he carried himself, the absence of that quiet distance he had always kept between himself and the rest of the world. And he did not stop to speak, did not nod or acknowledge in the way he once might have. Because this walk was not about being seen. It was about arriving somewhere he had avoided for too long. And back inside the diner, Clara Whitfield remained by the table, her hand finally lifting to pick up the badge, her fingers tracing its worn edge with a familiarity that spoke of years, not moments. And she held it for a second before placing it gently into the pocket of her apron, not as something to hide, but as something that had completed its purpose, and her eyes drifted toward the window, watching the figure of Ethan grow smaller as he moved down the road. And there was no smile, no visible relief, just a quiet stillness that carried its own kind of closure, because she had not needed to follow him, had not needed to remind him of what he had promised. The choice had been his to make, and now it was his to carry, and outside the wind moved again across the open land, brushing past fences and empty stretches of earth, heading toward the creek that had waded through seasons without change, unaware that someone was finally on his way, not to claim it, but to give it back. And in that quiet movement, unseen and unannounced, something long unsettled had begun to find its place again. The land by the creek did not look like much when Ethan Calloway reached it, just a quiet stretch of earth where the grass grew uneven and the water moved slowly, catching the late afternoon light in broken reflections. And for a long moment he stood there without stepping forward, as if crossing that final distance required more than just movement. And he let his eyes take it in, not as property, not as an entry in a ledger, but as something that had existed long before his name was ever tied to it. And he could almost see it the way another man once had, not in terms of profit, but in terms of belonging. And the thought settled deeper than he expected, heavier than anything he had carried out here before. And he finally stepped forward, boots pressing into the soft ground near the edge of the creek, and the sound was quiet, almost lost beneath the gentle movement of water, but to him it felt deliberate, like the first step into something that could not be undone. And he reached into his coat, pulling out the folded paper he had shown Clara Whitfield, the document that marked ownership in a language that never asked who it affected, only who it favored. And he unfolded it slowly, the creases soft from time, and for a moment he held it there, looking down at the lines that had once meant certainty, control, finality, and now felt like something else entirely, something incomplete, something that needed to be corrected. And he exhaled quietly, a breath that carried no hesitation now, only resolve. And he folded the paper again, not with care for its condition, but with a clarity of purpose, because this version of it would not last much longer. And he looked out across the land once more, letting the silence settle around him, not empty, but full in a way he had never noticed before, as if the place itself had been waiting, not for him, but for the right decision to finally reach it. And he turned slightly, scanning the horizon, seeing the faint outlines of fences in the distance, the boundaries he had once considered permanent. And for the first time he understood how easily those lines could shift, not by force, not by demand, but by choice. And he took one more step closer to the water, crouching slightly to let his fingers brush the surface, the coolness grounding him in the present, reminding him that this was real, that this moment existed beyond memory, beyond regret. And when he stood again, there was no doubt left in him, no second thought waiting to take hold, only a quiet certainty that what he had promised would be done, and that it would not end here, because returning the land was not the final act. It was the beginning of something he had avoided for too long. And as the sun lowered behind him, casting long shadows across the ground, Ethan Calloway remained there for a moment longer, not as the man who had claimed this place, but as the man who had finally chosen to give it back. By the time Ethan Calloway rode back into town, the light had shifted, softer now, stretched thin across rooftops and empty spaces, and nothing looked different at first glance. But something had changed in the way he moved through it, slower, more deliberate, like each step carried a weight he had finally chosen to acknowledge instead of outrun. And he did not stop at the saloon or the general store as he might have before, did not nod to the men who glanced his way with the same quiet respect they had always shown, because this was not a moment meant to be seen or witnessed. It was something that needed to be finished without noise. And he went straight to the small office near the edge of town where records were kept, where ownership was written in ink that rarely questioned itself. And he pushed the door open without force, stepping inside to the familiar smell of paper and dust, and the clerk behind the desk looked up with mild surprise, setting aside his pen as if unsure what had brought a man like Ethan there at this hour. And Ethan did not waste words, did not sit, did not soften the moment with small talk. He placed the folded document on the desk and said it needed to be changed, and the clerk blinked, glancing down at the paper before back up again. confusion flickering across his face because requests like this did not usually come from men who had already secured what they wanted. And he asked if there had been a mistake, something filed incorrectly, something that needed correcting, but Ethan shook his head once, steady, certain, and said there had been no mistake in the writing, only in the taking. And the words hung there, quiet but firm, and the clerk hesitated, not out of refusal, but because he sensed something unusual, something that did not fit the usual patterns of trade and claim and transfer. And he reached for the proper ledger, flipping through pages slowly, the sound of paper turning filling the room in a way that felt heavier than it should, and Ethan stood still while it happened, not pacing, not pressing, just waiting, because for once the waiting did not feel like a burden. It felt like a part of the process he had long avoided. And when the clerk found the entry, the line that tied Ethan's name to that piece of land by the creek, he paused again, pen hovering above the page, as if the act of changing it required more than just ink. And Ethan met his gaze briefly and gave a small nod, not commanding, not demanding, just confirming. And the pen moved, slow but certain, crossing out one name and writing another. And in that simple motion something shifted beyond the page itself, something that no ledger could fully record. And when it was done, the clerk set the pen down carefully, as if acknowledging the weight of what had just been written. And Ethan picked up the revised paper, folding it once more, not as something to keep, but as something to deliver. And as he turned to leave the office, the door closing softly behind him, the town outside remained unchanged. But Ethan Calloway no longer moved through it the same way, because for the first time in a long while, what he carried was not ownership, but something far more difficult to hold, the quiet responsibility of having chosen differently. When Ethan Calloway stepped back through the diner door, the bell above it gave the same quiet ring it always had, but this time it seemed to carry further, as if the sound itself understood something had been completed beyond its walls, and the late lights stretched across the wooden floor, catching the dust in the air and settling over the same tables, the same chairs, the same quiet rhythm that had not changed since he left. And yet Clara Whitfield noticed immediately, not because of what he carried in his hand, but because of how he carried himself. The weight had shifted, not gone, but steadied, and she stood where she had been before, near the table, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. And Ethan did not pause at the door this time, did not hesitate. He walked forward with a calm that came not from certainty, but from having already faced what mattered most. And he reached the table and placed the folded document down beside where the badge had once rested, his hand lingering just long enough to mark the gesture as complete, not offered, not negotiated, but returned. And he did not explain, did not outline the process, did not speak of offices or signatures or the clerk who had rewritten the line that tied his name to something that had never truly belonged to him, because none of that was the point. And Clara's eyes moved to the paper, then back to him, and for a brief second the silence between them held something different, not tension, not expectation, but a quiet acknowledgement that the choice had been carried through, not just spoken. And she reached for the document slowly, unfolding it with care, her fingers steady as her eyes traced the lines, the name, the boundary, the simple shift that restored what had once been taken. And when she finished, she did not smile, did not thank him, because gratitude was not what this moment required. And instead she folded the paper again and held it close, not as a possession, but as something returned to its rightful place. And Ethan stood there, waiting, not for approval, not for recognition, but because leaving too quickly would have felt like stepping away from the weight of it before it had fully settled. And Clara finally looked at him again, her gaze steady, softer, now but not weakened, and she gave a small nod, not of forgiveness, not of closure, but of acknowledgement, the kind that passes between two people who understand something without needing to name it. And that nod carried more meaning than any words could have held, because it marked the end of what had been carried in silence for years, and the beginning of something neither of them would define out loud. And Ethan inclined his head in return, not out of habit, but out of respect that had been earned too late to undo the past, but just in time to shape what came next. And the diner settled again into its quiet, unchanged from the outside. But within that small space, something had shifted in a way that would not be seen, only felt. And as Ethan turned to leave once more, the door opening to the same dusty street, he did not look back this time, not because he wanted to forget, but because there was nothing left to avoid, and Clara Whitfield remained by the table, the document in her hands, the badge in her pocket, and the silence around her no longer carried the weight it once had. It carried something steadier, something earned, something that did not need to speak to be understood. The days that followed did not arrive with noise or celebration. They came the way most honest changes do, quietly, without announcement, carried on the same wind that moved through the town as it always had. And if anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed small things. The way Clara Whitfield opened her diner each morning with a steadier hand. The way the light seemed to linger a little longer on her doorway. The way her silence no longer felt like something endured, but something chosen. And out by the creek the land rested as it had for years. But now there was a difference that could not be seen in the soil or the water, only in what it meant. And one morning Clara stood there, the document folded carefully in her apron pocket, the badge resting against her palm, and she walked the length of the ground slowly, not measuring it, not claiming it, just remembering, letting each step reconnect what had once been hers before it was ever written otherwise. And the breeze moved through the grass, soft, steady, carrying no trace of the past except what she chose to hold. And she stopped near the edge of the water, looking out across the quiet stretch. And for a long moment she did nothing at all, because there was nothing left that needed to be proven, nothing left to demand. And in town Ethan Calloway continued his days without speaking of what had happened. He did not mention the land, did not explain the change, and those who knew him only saw that something in him had shifted, not in the way he dressed or spoke, but in the way he paused before making decisions, in the way he listened a second longer than before, in the way he no longer filled silence as quickly as he once had. And that difference moved through his life without needing a name, shaping choices in ways even he did not fully track. And weeks later he rode past the edge of that same creek, not stopping, not approaching, just letting his gaze pass over it with a quiet understanding. And for the first time he did not see it as something taken or returned. He saw it as something that had never belonged to him at all. And that realization did not weigh him down. It steadied him, and back at the diner Clara placed the badge in a small wooden box behind the counter. Not hidden, not displayed, simply kept. A reminder not of what was lost, but of what had been faced. And the days moved forward, simple, unremarkable to anyone watching from the outside. But within them lay something rare, something earned, because no apology had been spoken, no forgiveness had been asked for, and still something had been set right, not by force, not by words, but by a man who chose not to walk away. Again, and a woman who never needed him to. And out there where the land met the water, the quiet remained, holding the kind of truth that did not need to be told, only lived. Because out here, justice did not ride in loud or fast. It arrived in silence and stayed.